Welcome. Welcome, everyone. I'm Ellen Dunham-Jones, your host of Redesigning Cities, the Speedwell Foundation Talks at Georgia Tech. This is episode 27, and I am delighted to share my screen and give some intros and welcomes. Thank you all for joining. So this slide is really just to give you a chance to quickly see the wide range of topics that we have covered in this series. And we record all of these talks, then edit them and share the videos on our YouTube channel and load the podcasts onto all of the major podcast platforms. So you can check them all out. They'll get the links on the Redesigning Cities website. And I hope you'll attend either the further ones, either in person or on Zoom. But you get to see really the wide range of topics. I hope you'll visit our website soon. Now, before we get started, I'd like to invite all of you, both online and in person, to pull out your phones and go to www.slido.com. There, if you enter the code pound 1008769, you can post questions throughout the talk and like other people's questions. We really look forward. We will try to answer as many questions as we can, and it really helps to have you post them on Slido. I will be moderating Q&A based only on what is posted on Slido. If the folks on Zoom are welcome to use chat to connect with other online folks, but I will not be moderating Zoom for questions. Now, while you have Slido open on your phone, and again, that code is pound 1008769, there's also a poll that I'm going to ask my GRAs to activate the poll if they can, because we wanted to ask, we're kind of curious about this audience. Here we're going to be talking about redesigning the house. Well, how would you describe the house that you live in? And if we haven't gotten the poll open yet, we'll have it open soon. So while you're doing Q&A, you can find the poll. We'd also love for you to follow, tweet, or post about today's talk on social media, and we have a whole bunch of links listed up here. So now, for those of you who are in the audience, please silence your phones because we are obviously recording this event. Now, today, I am delighted to welcome Diana Lind and Andrew Bruno to explore the question, if you change the house, how does it change the city? There's so much to talk about related to redesigning the house. We could talk about the American dream, the housing crisis, the financialization of housing by private equity investors, gentrification, changing demographics, let alone the impact of zoning revisions to better accommodate ADUs, accessory dwelling units, or what used to be called granny flats, tiny homes, missing middle, micro units, multi-generational living, co-living, and care work. It's a long, long list. To tackle all of this, I am very happy to be joined today by Andrew Bruno and Diana Lind. Andy just joined. I'm going to minimize this so we can see that. Andy just joined Georgia Tech as our newest Venture Next Fellow. An architect, before moving to Atlanta this summer, he worked in the design department of the New York City Housing Authority. His experience with public housing and public space was rewarded with the Institute for Public Architecture's 2020 Fall Fellowship. Yet, it's perhaps his redesign of the private house, and I put that in quotes, that has gained the most notoriety. He created an Instagram page called One House Per Day and posted a unique design of a detached house each day in 2020. Celebrated in numerous architectural venues, the 365 drawings have just been published in a book by Oro Editions to be released in next month. Okay. Diana Lind. I am also delighted to welcome Diana Lind to Georgia Tech. Like many of the urbanists in the audience, I began reading her work over a decade ago when she became the editor-in-chief, then executive director of Next City, a leading urbanist website and nonprofit based in Philadelphia. It remains a terrific resource for innovative, socially responsible programs and projects. But she went on to serve as a founding advisor to the New Cities Foundation and is currently a director with the Penn Institute for Urban Research. I've invited her to kick us off today by referencing her 2020 book, other prompt, Brave New Home, Our Future in Smarter, Simpler, Happier Housing. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and welcome Diana and invite you to share yours.
Thank you so much, Ellen. And before I share my screen, I just wanted to say what an honor it is to be a part of this program. Looking at that list of your past presenters and guests on your podcast, those are so many of my heroes in this space. And so it's just really a pleasure to have this opportunity to partner with you, to be introduced to Andrew, and to be here today. So thank you so much for having me. I am going to share my screen and kick off this slideshow. Please, if for some reason the slides get stuck, please just definitely interrupt me and let me know. That has happened once before and is not great. So I am, as Ellen mentioned, the author of a book called Brave New Home that came out in 2020. And the book really explores the history of single family housing, alternatives to it, and new ideas around housing policy that could help us create better communities and better housing. But I'm really here to give kind of a brief overview that is going to synthesize some of these ideas pretty quickly for us here and then kick off this conversation. So in brief, the general idea that I want to put forward here is that we live in a country of essentially one size fits all housing. And that is problematic. It's problematic to live in a country where the dominant housing type, the overwhelmingly dominant housing type is single family homes. And it's important to recognize that we didn't always live this way. It wasn't always that way, nor should we continue to live this way for a variety of social, economic, and environmental reasons. And so I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about how we didn't always live this way, because I think that's really important. A lot of people think about the single family home as being sort of a birthright of the United States, a kind of given here. Certainly, Ellen referenced the American dream. I know we're going to talk about that, but this idea that is so ingrained in American society that we are a country of single family homes with white picket fences, and that this is the way that it's always been. But it actually really wasn't always this way. We were really originally a country of dense urban areas with people living in a variety of different housing types that I think are worthy of some reflection, discussion, and kind of fresh eyes. So the slide that I have here is a picture of a boarding house in Tacoma, Washington in the 1800s. And in front of it are about 30 of its residents or so. And it's essentially two twin houses that today would probably house somewhere between 4 and 8 people. And certainly we could agree that 30 people or so in this space is too many. I would also contend probably 4 is too few. Boarding houses were a very common way in which Americans lived in the 1800s. And in urban areas, about half of city dwellers either were boarders or had housed boarders. So it was a super common way, and it was a very efficient way for people to move to US cities, be able to access their work, walk to work, live affordably, make connections, and to really access housing in a way in which you could kind of imagine today is pretty unthinkable, or is is not available these days. There weren't just boarding houses. There were a lot of different other housing types that were really prevalent prior to the World Wars. So on this slide, I'm showing some images of apartment hotels, which were a popular housing style, kind of especially around the turn of the 20th century, when apartment hotels were seen as a way for people to access the city. And in a way, it was sort of a progressive feminist housing type where people could, families, couples, single people could live in apartment hotels. They could eat in public dining rooms where there would be social activity. Women would sort of be separated from their domestic responsibilities at the time because apartment hotels offered not just, that food in the dining rooms, but also cleaning, laundry, etc. And this is, kind of a style of living that was pretty common, not just at that turn of the century, but continued for quite some time, people living in kind of more extended stay hotel situations, and really ended up being zoned out more in the 60s, 70s, and 80s in a lot of urban areas. There are a lot of housing types that were that you probably recognize in and around the places that you live. These are some pictures of two flats that were very common in Chicago. And these were duplexes that were could be found a housing type that you could find in many different cities. And it was a great housing type, particularly as people were trying to find ways to, say, have a little bit of privacy, but live near their relatives. You could live in one apartment and your parents or your children could live in the other one. It was also a great way for people to build equity, living in one apartment, renting one out. These kinds of duplexes also have become very difficult to find, in terms of zoning in the US, very difficult to build. And in many cases, in a lot of cities like in Chicago, they're actually a threatened housing type because a lot of the existing two flats are being turned into single family homes because those are more easier for developers to sell and more expensive and lucrative. So these are some of the various different ways that we lived kind of prior to the emergence and dominance of single family homes. I think a lot of that history has been sort of forgotten, as a lot of people, when you talk about, the ways that people lived in cities, it gets kind of collided with these images of, say, how the other half lives. This is an image from Jacob Riis's very famous book that exposed, rightfully so, the undignified and unsafe and unhealthy living conditions of people in overcrowded urban areas. But I think that it's important to kind of separate out what were, first of all, some of the very positive aspects of different urban styles of living, and frankly, the very distinct disadvantages of kind of tenement living that were kind of prevalent at the time. But certainly these kinds of compelling images really got ingrained in American culture as the problems with urban, dense housing. And so what you end up having, shortly after that, sorry, my slides kind of skipped ahead here. Oops. Sorry, one moment. There we go. That's the one I was looking for. At that, at the end of World War I, a kind of government-led campaign that was amplified by media to really kind of encourage people to own your own home, live in privacy, live with your own backyard, and to have that kind of economic stability of owning your own home. And it was really a moral tale that I think, again, has gotten very ingrained in our culture, which is that, this picture says, own a home for your children's sake. That I think a lot of people grew to feel that if you didn't own your own home, you were somehow threatening your family, that you weren't doing your part as a parent, that you were kind of doing something that was unhealthy even. And really beyond just kind of the propaganda campaign around owning your own home, there were a variety of different tools that that the government produced over the coming decades to really encourage owning your own home. So certainly the kinds of financial tools like the mortgages that came out of the sort of Depression era that enabled returning veterans from war to access housing, and just a much broader swath of the American population to access housing. And it really encouraged home ownership in the US, not only through those financial tools, and I'm sure many of you being in this field know certainly about all the various different types of infrastructure to encourage suburbanization and sort of less expensive housing beyond cities. But as you can see from this picture here, this is a graph showing the home ownership rate in the US. It was very successful in promoting home ownership. And that's certainly something that I think a lot of people say, hey, this was great that the US was able to get so many people to be homeowners, to go from, about 40% of the US population to over 65% being homeowners. But the truth is that that homeownership really wasn't widespread across the US. This is an image of how racial covenants in Minneapolis segregated that particular city. And certainly the combination of racial covenants that went along with the sale of single family homes and that kind of home ownership that really, even to this day, has been in some ways kind of reserved for the white population in this country, that, all these various different factors have really kind of shown that homeownership is not the kind of widespread positive that sort of popular culture tends to think of it as. Even in majority Black cities, there is a double-digit homeownership gap between white and Black populations. So I'm getting into a little bit of that kind of conversation about some of the challenges and problems with single family homeownership and kind of the culture that we have, that we've built with it over time. As we sort of focused on home ownership and single family homes, it's become a very expensive housing type. And in addition to the fact that, single family homes are the largest size homes, zoning encouraged, minimum lot sizes, minimum housing sizes that really have kind of exacerbated the cost of housing. So now we're in this very strange situation where over the past 50 years, the average housing size has, nearly doubled. Meanwhile, the average household size has started to really decline. So we have, something like 2.5 people living in close to 3,000 square feet nowadays. And it's really, when you look at that family of 7 and those how the other half lives, it's really kind of the pendulum has swung in a completely different direction. And there are a lot of kind of social, economic, and environmental challenges that come with that. Certainly the economic challenge being that housing at that price per square foot rate is really expensive. But there's other challenges that come with living in neighborhoods that are dominated by just single family homes. Obviously, when you have houses that are on on an acre or even half-acre lots, that doesn't allow you to have the kind of density of commercial activity and kind of the urban core that you might end up having in a neighborhood that has lots of different housing types in it. And that can create social problems. Here's a slide about how loneliness is more dangerous than obesity and as bad as smoking cigarettes. So there are kind of social impacts by not having those social interactions as a result. So as I'm kind of concluding here on the challenges of single family housing, and then I want to move into how there's really this mismatch ultimately between that style of housing and the population that we have today. So we have a much more diverse population than the 1950s population that we had when the suburban model really kind of boomed. Nowadays, we're seeing a consistent increase in multi-generational living, so which is much more prevalent among people of color than it is among white families. And we're seeing a mismatch between, there's this huge population that wants to live multi-generationally, needs to live multi-generationally, and it's kind of banging up against the sort of single family household size, single family housing type, I mean. We also have a younger generation that is just vastly different than it was in the 1950s, much more focused on experiences rather than things, much less likely to get married, to have much more likely to have children much later in life, have smaller family sizes. And so when you start to look at all these various different aspects, you start to wonder, why are we still building this single family house that was really kind of predicated on ideas of family over a century ago, that is not conducive to, say, the digital nomads of today, or people who might, be married, then decouple, recouple, all the various different kinds of households. So what does that American dream look like now? I'm going to wrap up in just a few quick slides, and I'll seg into Andrew's presentation about different housing types. So I would contend there's a lot of different ideas around what does that American dream look like now. This is an image from a developer out on the West Coast called United Dwelling, which will build you an accessory dwelling unit in your backyard in exchange for a portion of the rent, right? So the American dream for a lot of people might end up being having a rent producing property on their property. It's not necessarily just having that privacy in that big backyard. That could be one idea of the American dream nowadays. This is an image of a co-living environment. This was actually a picture of We Live, which is no longer in operation anymore, but co-living has emerged as a trend, particularly prior to the pandemic, and I really start to see it kind of becoming much more a part of the conversation again nowadays. But increasingly, as people are trying to find ways to connect with people socially, co-living is a really great opportunity for people who are moving to cities that kind of want that almost experience of that like boarding house, but in a way that's more stylish, that works with some of their ideas of what an interesting social life might be. And instead of kind of paying for more space, you're paying for more amenities and social experiences that come from co-living. It might look like much more purpose-built multi-generational housing. So this is a project near Tucson, where a essentially low-income development for multi-generational families, particularly grand families. So even getting down to that very, niche category of grandparents raising grandchildren, and looking at, what are some of the different design elements here that would really kind of appropriately value this particular demographic. It would be, if you're going to have a 2-bedroom, requiring that there are 2 bathrooms, which is not the way that a developer would build, say, a typical 2-bedroom, but it's really important to grandfamilies, to grandparents, to have, their own separate bathroom from young children, or to have it have sort of universal design elements so that both younger and older people can access the space in a certain way, or to have, there are some images here of these little shutters which can open and close, so to create your patio that's nice and private, but open if you want to connect with your neighbors as well. So thinking about how we have to change multi-generational housing to kind of accommodate the growing multi-generational population. And I'll end with this slide here, which is an image from a major developer, I think it was a Lennar floor plan for a new style of housing, which is their next gen model, which includes, what they call their next gen living room and bedroom. And it's an accessory dwelling unit that's built into this new single family home. And I really think, kind of segging here into Andrew's talk, that the future of the single family home is one that is being tweaked to kind of accommodate these new demographic changes. And that might be, and as we talk a little bit more about policies, that might be one of the fastest ways to kind of get to new styles of housing that better kind of accommodate people today and also are more affordable and healthier for people to be living in. So I will stop there, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Diana. All right, Andrew, you're on.
Well, that was, very inspiring, and Diana's work is so comprehensive and both identifies the kind of challenges facing an innovative approach towards new housing, as well as the potential solutions to those problems. So in a sense, my work that I'm going to talk about today kind of comes at it from the approach of those problems having been solved. So like, what could we start to, as architects, how can we start to imagine in the absence of the kind of like intense restrictions that are placed on housing by things like zoning or covenants or HOA restrictions? How could the architectural typology of the detached house, which is deeply ingrained in American culture as a kind of desirable place to live, kind of desirable architectural typology in which to live, be modified or hacked or reimagined to accommodate more diverse ways of living, more diverse forms of social association, more diverse conditions of inhabitation and program. And so as a kind of deep background, I'm really interested in the way in which the house has kind of historically been used as a tool for architects in America to communicate with broader publics. So the kind of ideal of the cottage house detached in an idyllic suburban landscape was actually kind of really helped in its infancy by architects like Andrew Jackson Downing, who used a very specific mode of representation, the kind of vignette, coupled with more traditional architectural orthographic drawings to depict this kind of idyllic way of life that living in a small cottage house would entail. And I think that there's something really interesting in that, in the sense that architects have kind of lost our ability to communicate with broader publics. So my project that kind of responds to that is called One House Per Day. And it's a project in which for the year 2020, for every day I drew a different detached house. So there are 365 total houses. And basically every day I would post a different house on Instagram. And the project has since expanded. I just don't have the juice to still like be drawing a house every day. And so I've expanded it to encompass different guest authors who bring different ideas to the table. But the basic proposition is a kind of low stakes daily meditation on how the house as an architectural typology might expand to, transcend the strictures that are currently placed on it by things like zoning or its need to accommodate only the single nuclear family. My shameless plug here, as Ellen mentioned, is that there is a book coming out of the first 365 houses. So it's currently available for pre-order on Amazon. Check it out. It will also shortly be available for pre-order direct from ORO Editions. Will probably be a discount code, so keep that in mind. So, okay, done shilling. And basically what I've done here is to kind of select almost at random some of the original 365 drawings that I think in one way or another can begin to address some of the issues that that Diana identifies in her much more rigorous scholarly research. So one of the things is that there's intense possibility within the architectural form of the house to accommodate different sorts of family structures or different types of kind of social arrangements, but also the ability to to provide space for different types of use. So this is a house in which a kind of large central workspace is flanked by a number of different private rooms for sleeping. But notice that the workspace has seating for far more people than could actually live in the house. And so there's an idea here about kind of opening the territory of the house to encompass the kind of transient occupation by more than just the number of people that live there. Again and again throughout the original 365 houses, the idea of how you could kind of pare back the house to its sort of like, minimum spatial requirements, but in a way like maximum architectural embellishment as a way of kind of getting at an issue that Diana very correctly identifies, which is that you just can't buy a small house anymore. That like if you're one person or two people, you might want to live in a house, but you might not want a 1,500 square foot house, which is about as small as you're going to get these days. And so there are a number of houses that are like this that are kind of stripped down to, 4 or 5 rooms. This house is maybe 400 square feet, but you can imagine a rich life taking place within it. Some of the houses are maybe a little bit less earnest than others. So one of the kind of aspects of the current manifestation of the house is that it's built on, more than a century's worth of kind of emphasis on privacy, that privacy is kind of the highest ideal. And so a lot of the houses in One House Per Day kind of intentionally, sarcastically vibe in exactly the opposite direction. So this is one of my favorites. It's a little bit much for most people probably, but the idea is that there's actually no single wall hits the ground in this house, that the kind of different spaces within are implied by like super deep coffers in the ceiling, but you would always kind of like see your roommate's feet walking around and stuff like that. Or like this one, which is basically a 16 square matrix of rooms in which there's just this giant amorphous bed that takes up like the entire floor area. So these are kind of like more intellectual kind of riffs on the opposition to our like intense focus on privacy. But a lot of the houses are kind of more earnest, like this one that is very much in the sort of ADU territory. And I would definitely, have the caveat that like I'm skeptical of the current ADU craze as a sort of like permanent solution, in as much as it has the potential to kind of create this permanent underclass. Either you're in the main house or you're in the ADU. But that being said, something is better than nothing, and I think that it's important for architects to be kind of thinking about how our living space can be kind of made more efficient or more kind of pared down. And so this is maybe like a 300 square foot house, but you can imagine that because it is sort of planned efficiently, it has the potential to provide a kind of rich condition of inhabitation for 1 or 2 people. On the somewhat more extreme end of things, this is like, the real minimum, where like each room is so small that you need to get into it from the outside. Some of the houses are kind of more like explicitly sort of, communal. So if some of the less earnest houses that we saw before kind of really turn our conceptions of privacy on its head, houses like this similarly really emphasize large collective spaces, but acknowledge the reality that for communal living to really work, there needs to be the possibility for absolute privacy. So this is kind of a collection of cells, sort of like private monk cells that are all arrayed along this like very, very large communal space that kind of has everything that a single person might need. Some of the houses try to explore different tactics for imagining how people with different sizes or abilities might be accommodated by by the architectural material of the house, in opposition to the kind of one size fits all issues that Diana is identifying. So this is a house in which the openings between rooms are all at different sizes. So the way that an adult might move through this house is different from the way that like a child or a pet might move through it. And I'll close with this one because it kind of combines a number of those things. So this is a house that is kind of like, the classic 4 square, provides space for 1 or 2 people, but also incorporates workspace that goes beyond the kind of traditional home office that might be allowed by current zoning, to imagine that this might be a house in which like the person that lives there has a small office with a few employees that can come here to work. So I want to close by just emphasizing that, though architects don't often, want to deal with the house super earnestly as a kind of like valid object of study or speculation or reflection, it's very much in the culture right now. And so we saw this tendency in the 2020 presidential election for the political right to kind of demonize the idea of eliminating single family zoning as the Democrats are out to abolish the suburbs. And I think that we all kind of know that's not true. We're just trying to imagine how they might be made to be more diverse. But these issues are political, and I think that it's important for us to be thinking of them as such. And finally, I'll just note that the insanity in the housing market right now has become so extreme that normal people or non-architects are kind of starting to think about this for a lot of people, probably the first time, but mostly because you just can't avoid it anymore. So I think that it's a really opportune and fertile time for architects to be speculating on how this typology that is so ingrained in American culture might be made to do more. So again, really looking forward to the rest of this conversation. Thank you.
All right, let's stop sharing and we will go into discussion mode. So, well, thank you both. Sort of never sure quite where to look when on Zoom. But, one of the topics that I think, came up with both of you, I mean, Diana, you talked about sort of those images of what we would today consider overcrowded housing, and the famous Jacob Riis photographs and things. And then Andy, you're kind of, talking about that pursuit of privacy that comes out of that fear of overcrowding. Have we gotten to the point where now the desire for community and communal spaces, I won't necessarily say inside or outside the home, is that really where we are? Is this being kind of driven by we've succeeded too much in achieving privacy? Or is it just plain household size has gotten smaller and it's just demographics or destiny? Diana, what do you think?
Yeah, well, community used to be your household, right? For many people, if you had 7 people in your household, you probably would never be bored, just hang out with the folks in your house. So I definitely think that for now we're at a point where our population, 25% plus of the population lives alone. So if you are living alone, you're probably going to be seeking community somewhere else. And for a lot of people, online provides one option, but I think a lot of other people are trying to figure out, how can they find community in other spaces. And so, but at the same time, then you've got this challenge in a lot of cities where those third spaces have also become kind of boring in a certain way. Like, even if, coffee shops were really cool in the 1990s, they're not really anymore in the 2020s as much so. And I think that kind of desire to figure out, well, couldn't there be some way to that my house could be somehow more communal, I think is really attractive for a lot of people. The barrier is that it doesn't exist in so many places. I mean, I can't tell you how many people who have told me about their fantasies of living in some kind of, way closer to their friends or their family, but it's just not an option in so many places. And so, what I wanted to show at the book and talk about today is this actually did exist at some point. We could do it again. We could, it's a duplex is a community in many cases, just off the bat. I think that I'm looking forward to the conversation, the back and forth on ADUs, but there are many pros and cons there, but so many cases that is also about, for many people, a community of some sorts. And those kinds of, more interesting creative options, like whether it's co-living, apartment hotels, or different housing types that are, back in the day, there used to be housing specifically for sailors or typists or, you know, young women moving to a city or whatever else. These kinds of things have fallen out of favor, but I think that a lot of people would be really game for them if we found the ways to bring them back.
I think it's really interesting kind of as you look at those things. I know my mom really wanted the Golden Girls house. I mean, as she was getting older, and though those really just didn't exist. And it is also interesting to think about the housing for particular types and apartments in Atlanta is actually kind of was one of the several ground zeros, but of the swinging singles apartment complexes in the 70s.
Right.
I mean, it was the first time it was considered okay for women to, previously women were expected, you live at your father's house and then you live at your husband's house.
Right.
And this introduction of that there was a sort of in between there that was absolutely social, and movies made about that and things, but I don't know. And Andy, I think you could start doing one apartment building a day, but that's a whole other conversation. What do you think about this privacy community thing?
No, thank you. Well, I think that if your question is, have we successfully inculcated privacy as the kind of number one criterion for like what makes successful housing? Then I think that we've done that. And I think that the result has been, you know, kind of generations of people who deal with a huge amount of social isolation and obviously all of the issues attendant in that with the built environment. I don't know, in a sense, like, you know, when you see, for example, the kind of like more sort of commune oriented houses that I just showed, those are kind of reacting to the possibility that like we might just never have more diverse like kind of overall urban patterns in our suburbs, and like how can you maybe start to get that diversity, which has the kind of implication of maybe a slightly less degree of privacy, but you know, maybe just a sort of more pared down privacy within the kind of territory of the individual house. I mean, I guess the way that I would simplify is to say that like, there's not necessarily a problem with privacy. I think that privacy is really important. Everyone needs to have the opportunity to kind of like be totally alone sometimes. But the emphasis on like the entire, you know, 2,000 square foot house as this bastion of privacy that is totally inviolable, I think is, you know, has had some really obviously negative consequences.
Well, all right. So to address those negative consequences, we're living in interesting times. We've seen some pretty interesting policy changes. Zoning and land use have historically always been seen as the purview of local municipalities, local counties. I mean, very locally dealt with. States, let alone the federal government, never sort of dared not step in. It was considered not their turf. And yet, since Minneapolis did away with exclusively single-family home zoning, California, Oregon, and Washington as states have followed suit. California is increasingly establishing state laws that supersede local laws when it comes to allowing affordable housing on commercial land, or sort of allowing higher density if you include more affordable housing. So, you know, Diana, you document the real flood of ADUs that have appeared in California. I mean, I think I saw some recent statistics in Los Angeles, and it was just the number of ADUs so exceeded that have been built just in the last 5 years, so exceeded the number of affordable housing units deliberately added to the market, or, you know, and exceeded the number that had been lost from the market through obsolescence. So it's not to say that all those ADUs are super affordable, but tell us more about what you see as the impact of these kinds of policy changes.
Yeah, well, so I think that the statewide changes are really exciting because so many municipalities don't have the bandwidth or the capacity to implement or, have those battles around zoning. And so having, kind of statewide policies that trickle down to all parts of the state is really exciting, I think. And, I can say in Philadelphia, even, we had a battle over accessory dwelling units here and couldn't get the entire city to vote on having accessory dwelling units. And so it's now, it depends on which council district you live in, whether you're able to, and it's kind of ridiculous. I mean, how can you actually develop accessory dwelling units if you can't do them across the region, in which you're living in? And so having that kind of like economies of scale really, I think, is really important to actually being able to produce it in terms of, both the field, the industry actually being able to develop the housing, and then also ensuring that there's like appropriate regulation. And so I think that the statewide route is really exciting for this work. Yeah, I mean, I can kind of go on, but I would say, like, I would just, I feel like the idea of also there being carrots that we're providing. So like that, I think, is a new area of federal policy. Like, we're not going to give you CDBG money unless you're showing that you're actually building more housing that is not single family zoned. That kind of thing is really exciting. I also think that, to the discussion about accessory dwelling units, like, one of the reasons why I remain still positive about this is that I also think that, in many cases, we don't really have the capacity to be building housing from the government that we would like. I mean, it would be great if we were building more public housing and if we were, actually able to do that in a way. But in many cases, like, that's not the case. And I don't love the fact that most of the accessory dwelling units are being built by people who already have a tremendous amount of housing equity. And I think that we need to think about, if we're going to have, if we're going to really see accessory dwelling units as this opportunity to be building more, more affordable housing types and get that kind of housing diversity that creates, economic diversity and all sorts of diversity in our neighborhoods and density and so on, we have to think about, like, what are the appropriate financing tools? So it was interesting when Andrew was mentioning the idea of there being like a permanent underclass and that potentially being a problem with the accessory dwelling units. And one of the things that I think is so critical is finding ways to finance the accessory dwelling unit renter into owning that, and getting into some kind of co-op with the primary housing owner, or finding ways for people to buy property with an accessory dwelling unit with the financing taking into account that they're going to rent the main house out. I think that's the new starter home. The new starter home is you living in the accessory dwelling unit, you rent that big house out until you can afford to be, in the big house, and then you rent the small house out. And then maybe, when you're in your 60s or 70s and you're retiring, you rent the big house out again, whatever it might end up being. But I think that kind of thing would help address what I think is a legitimate concern around the fact that, ADUs, I think, are primarily paid for by people who have the financial savvy, the finances and the savvy to actually be able to build them, not the people who kind of need them and could use them as tools for building equity.
So Andy, you worked for a city housing authority.
That's true.
Single family housing is not really the main huge chunk of, it's not most of New York City's housing. But what do you think about kind of state rules coming in? What do you think about, and just how housing in that context of our super dense city, how is it being redesigned in New York?
Well, Diana correctly identifies the reality that we're not likely to have any new public creation of housing anytime soon. Certainly in New York, the New York City Housing Authority, which is where I was working, cannot imagine the creation of new, certainly cannot imagine the creation of new public housing, period. Can't imagine the creation of new affordable housing without the sort of partnership of private industry. So yeah, I mean, I think that there's certainly, Diana correctly identifies the reason why I'm not like out here like no ADUs, because it's something and it's better than nothing. And we're not likely to get the thing that would be better, which is simply the public creation of more public housing. Not just for, I'm a believer in the idea that municipalities should be kind of taking the sort of 1930s view of public housing as a sort of public service for, that is not necessarily income restricted or has a much higher kind of maximum bound for, for sort of maximum income, as a way of diversifying, or even the public creation of market rate housing as a tool to finance the creation of housing for people that have less money. None of that is likely to happen in the United States anytime soon, or probably ever. And so, yeah, we totally need to be getting more creative about how we think about the creation of, housing that is affordable. I think that, like, affordable housing tends to have a very specific architectural connotation. So like, yeah, housing that is affordable is maybe exactly the same thing. But yeah, I think that ADUs can achieve that, but with all of the caveats that we discussed.
Mhm. All right, I want to shift a little bit to just talk about these new housing types and the design alternatives in addition to ADUs, because ADUs is not, it's not the only new one out there. So Diana, your book investigates, you actually went and lived in, at least overnight, if not, I don't know how long, but you went and visited various new kinds of tiny homes, multi-generational homes, ADUs, garage to residences conversions, eco villages, even hospital-built housing for the homeless and the chronically ill. I mean, so all of these types that are arguably making residents happier, healthier, and just a better fit for what their circumstances are. You point out that the younger generation is just, more into experience than stuff. They spend so much time online that they crave social contact, value social contact a little bit, maybe more than previous generations, and that they enjoy the lifestyle freedom of not owning a home, especially during the pandemic. I can go live here, I can go live there, I can kind of work from home if I'm working remotely. But how much is it that, do you think they're really choosing to not own a single family home? Or is it that they're just sort of making the best of the fact that they are saddled with so much student debt that and the prices have gone up so sky high, they just can't possibly afford one? So, where do you see that range?
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, obviously, you can't speak on behalf of all the members of an entire generation. So, I am certain that there are many different ways in which younger people feel about owning stuff and versus not owning. And certainly I've seen lots of surveys and data about that there's, people would love to own their own homes, they just can't, and so on. I also, though, would say that, there are a lot of other different demographic trends that kind of point to people, a younger generation making sort of lifelong commitments later in life or less frequently. So, the sort of getting married, having kids, buying a house package is much less of a thing now than it was in the 1950s, right? There's just much less of this kind of like predictable pattern of what happens to people after they're exiting their 20s. And so as a result of that, I think that there's, not only is there less pressure to get into owning a home, but there may be also less desire to do that, because why, Why buy a house if you're not certain that you're going to be living in that neighborhood for the rest of your life, or not even, the rest of your life, but, 2 years from now. So I think that there's certain ways that I think it's a combination, right? I think certainly if this were, and what I do see is this kind of younger generation, like I've read a lot about sort of younger people being more focused on figuring out ways to save money to like retire early or focus on their passion careers less than kind of, just working forever. And so instead of just buying a house to live in, buying rental properties to have passive income, I think there's just like a very different vision for people of what home ownership and homes mean. And so I think that is kind of part of it. And I think, I would just underscore the fact that the whole point of bringing up these different alternatives to the single family home is acknowledging the ways in which we've had sort of this orthodoxy of the single family home, and we are a much more diverse and fragmented country than that. And so as a result, we should have many more different types of housing options and pathways for people.
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in and just say that I think that the essence of that kind of diversity is the ability to do what you want to within it. And part of the problem is that, yeah, people my age are getting married less and having kids less because it is, well, certainly getting married is not necessarily expensive, but having kids certainly is, and buying a house certainly is. Like, this is purely anecdotal, but just in my experience, I have a kid in daycare right now. It's rent. I don't know how you could have more than one kid. So there's your declining household size. And yeah, it's basically, prohibitively expensive to buy property. I think that plenty of people want to do it. Certainly, I wish that we could imagine a way in which the creation of wealth is decoupled from property ownership, because obviously part of our problem now is the perverse incentives created when property ownership is the primary means of kind of generating wealth in America. Because obviously by, and I'm no economist by any stretch of the imagination, but simple supply and demand, that if you have an asset and there are many more of that asset out there, your asset is going to be worth less. So that's why you end up with, people who will fight against new housing at any cost, because they're worried that it's going to lower their property values, and maybe it will, but I think that the problem is then that if your property value gets lowered, then suddenly your retirement is in jeopardy. And that to me is the issue, that like your broader financial health is tied to the value of your home. And that obviously is going to incentivize you to fight against, the lowering of your property value, which would in turn make it possible. If your property value is lower, then it's possible for people that don't have as much money to buy similar property. And so it's this very perverse cycle that is created by, the emphasis on property ownership as the primary means of wealth generation.
And I think it's really important that you brought up, that sort of retirement, because they say that, we spend almost all our entire life savings in the last 6 months of life.
Oh, wow.
That's hospital bills and usually if it's a married couple, the man dies first and the woman is left as a pretty destitute widow. That is the pattern. And if we could fix, so we have to redesign our healthcare system in order perhaps to better redesign. But Diana, you end the book with, I think, a really exciting chapter of just speculating about the alternative models to generational wealth creation. So how do we get out of, if we don't, it hasn't been that long. I mean, my grandparents didn't make a killing on their house. The point of having a house often was, yes, you wanted to have something, you would pass that on to your children. That was often how having a house was seen as an asset. It was security, but it wasn't this financial wealth kind of thing. I don't know. Tell us more about what some of your proposals, or what we need to get out of this cycle?
Yeah, well, so I would just say that, we really spent a century perfecting the mortgage and housing industry as it is, and spent a lot of time figuring out kind of how to kind of build wealth through home ownership. Oftentimes when you look at, various different agendas for creating more racial equity, more, economic equity in this country, home ownership is just constantly put there as like that. The solution would be getting more homeowners. That's always the solution for increasing wealth. And I think that there has been just a complete lack of conversation at the thought leadership level, but certainly at the national government level of kind of thinking about like, well, what could be some other ways to actually generate wealth for people over time that isn't, just housing and isn't just a job. And so I think, in terms of what some of the other options might be, there are very small experiments, I would say, when you look at the vastness of the sort of status quo in terms of things like community land trusts, right? Being able to have the community essentially owning the wealth of the neighborhood, and that kind of releases that valve of the perverse incentives that Andrew was mentioning. And I think could be a really interesting option. There are certain, I would want to give a shout out to folks like Eve Picker, who has Small Change, which is a community, crowdfunding of housing opportunities. So instead of actually having to think about building your wealth, owning your single family home, you could actually build wealth by being an investor in developments of multifamily properties and things like that. So trying to find ways in which people could kind of see themselves actually getting invested in projects, hopefully maybe in their neighborhoods, or it could be, across the US where you're in, you could be investing in development and actually getting housing built, but it doesn't have to be, your own home. But I think there just needs to be a much broader conversation about this in terms of, recognizing that this is a problem, not just in terms of the fact that there are, racial divides in terms of home ownership rates in the US, but also in terms of who's actually owning homes at this point. I mean, increasingly investors are the ones who are buying and selling housing. And so it's if you look at it at the long game, if you were to, kind of take these different trends of the numbers of investors owning homes and project it out into 2 decades from now, let's say, you start to see that you would have something around, quarter of a given city being owned by investors and not even residents themselves. So then you actually have to seriously start thinking about, what could be ways of ensuring people kind of economic stability. And maybe that's also the way to frame it a little bit more, is thinking about this as economic stability rather than necessarily like wealth creation. So sort of to that point about, you mentioned like the destitute widow, and people just sort of being, financially wrecked by health issues. I thought you were going to seg into the conversation about, hospitals building housing, but I really do think that there needs to be a better kind of synthesis between housing and healthcare in terms of recognizing that they are, intricately connected, and that, for a lot of people, like healthcare is a huge cost. And so figuring out ways to create stability through better healthcare or through healthier housing actually is another idea. So I just think it's like a huge reframing of how we're thinking about people's connection to their housing and their economic stability and their lively stability.
Absolutely. Well, so Andy, you've just, if you've got anything to add on, I think you've sort of also talked about the need for this. Do you have any creative new ideas on how we rethink the financing on the house?
No, I don't.
Ellen, you? That's okay.
I'm along for the ride.
You do have ideas as an architect. You do have ideas about the design of the house and the design of the city. As a newcomer to Atlanta, what strikes you as the most fertile ground here in our fair city for redesigning the house? What advice would you give your students?
I don't know. I think that Atlanta actually is kind of potentially well positioned to be doing some really amazing work in this regard. As the kind of prototypical sprawling city, there's just kind of a giant canvas on which to actually explore with different typologies if we can get beyond single family zoning. And I think that, there is a movement in the Atlanta DCP seemingly to actually try to, whether on a small or large scale, begin to experiment with different ways that we might kind of inhabit the giant area that is Atlanta.
Mhm.
So, in terms of what I would say to my students, I've already said everything. We're basically doing this in our studio right now. Imagining how within the kind of urban scale and architectural language of the single family neighborhood, you might begin to inject programmatic diversity is kind of the subject of our studio right now. So we'll see how it goes.
Okay. All right. Well, I want to thank you both for the conversation. I want to now invite the audience to please, I'm going to start looking at the questions. The first thing I'm going to do is tell you the results of the poll. So let's see, 17%, 21% of attendees, and please go ahead and add some more, describe where they live as a detached house for one household. So kind of the standard, only 21% that were in that. A detached house that was subdivided for more than one household, 11%. 16% in a duplex, triplex, quad that was designed for multiple households, but still at the scale. So we have a lot of missing middle here in Atlanta, certainly in Atlanta. I don't know about how much of this is online or here. 11% in a townhouse. We're getting quite a kind of fairly even numbers here. But then a whopping, not too surprising, given a college town here, college audience, 26%, that's our majority, are in an apartment or condo in a multifamily building that's bigger than a quote unquote house. Nobody in an apartment or condo in a building that was not originally designed to be residential, although I live in a converted warehouse, so I'm one. And 11% in a small apartment, dorm room, micro unit, whatever, in a co-living building or dormitory. Nobody in a cottage court, nobody in a tiny home, 5% in other. Not sure quite which others. Anyway, all right, let's go to Q&A. And I know there were a few people that I think posted comments in the Zoom chat, but I'm going to really just focus on Q&A. First up, it is surprising to notice that the percent of multi-generational living increases as the average household size drops. What is the possible explanation for that? Diana, that's on you.
Oh, that's a good one. I would say that, I think it's just two different demographic trends, right? So, even if you have a single family, an increasing number of people who are living as singles, right? So that trend is increasing at the same time, and it's kind of balancing out the multi-generational household size. So that would be my guess of kind of how you end up still seeing that. I would have to run the math a little bit to figure out, exactly, because I think it's generally acknowledged that it's somewhere around 20% of the population is living in multi-generational households, but that's still less than the number of people who are living alone. And so if you the average household size, I think in 2018 was somewhere around 2.5 people. So it's still more than one, but it's, and also multi-generational households could include like a grandma, a daughter, and her son or something like that. That's a multi-generational household and it's only 3 people. So it's not always lots and lots of people. It could be, even your typical family of 4 plus a grandparent or something like that.
All right, Andy, I've got one for you here.
Good boy.
Most of the one house per day designs answer practical concerns with aesthetically playful solutions. To what extent should this be a priority in real life?
I mean, I think that's, if you're not into playful solutions, then, don't hire me as your architect. Nothing in there is meant to be kind of universal or, a template for, broader.
That's why you have
broader
365 of them.
That's why there are 365. I mean, I think, yeah, of course, some of those are very playful, and maybe some of the more playful ones tend to be less realistic. But I also think that like we've become so hemmed in by the way that we think about housing by the sort of standardization that the last century has brought, both in terms of, the programmatic diversity of the house and the, vanishing diversity in kind of, architectural tactics. So yeah, I think that some playfulness is productive, even if, I was actually designing a house, it might have walls that hit the floor.
But so, all right, if I was, if I was at the National Home Builders Association annual meeting that gets like 75,000 people showing up in Las Vegas to find out what is the plan that sold the most last year, and ergo will become the plan that is most reproduced in the coming year, I would want to I would absolutely look at how many of your household designs got likes, which was the most liked, and what can that tell us about at least where people's playful desires, whether that's really means they would build it, but what does it tell us? Which ones were most liked?
Well, also,
what does it tell us about the market, the desires?
I'm not sure that it tells us anything, because the house that is the most liked, likes are a very imperfect metric of kind of relevance or even enthusiasm. This is to like radically veer off into social media discourse. The percentage of people that like one of my posts to the number of people who viewed it, or rather the percentage of people who like relative to the number of people that view a post is almost identical for every single post. And so it ends up being a matter of like how many people see it. And that's kind of down to the, opacity of the Instagram algorithm. So I don't know. I think maybe the most liked one in history is like some crazy thing with like semicircular rooms or whatever. I don't know that it would have made it to the top of the National Home Builders Association annual meeting.
Oh, well. All right. So a question that received quite a few likes. Often property taxes in the suburbs are lower than in the city, and yet the suburbs have better schools. Don't you think we have to start reversing these economics? And how might we begin to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that unfortunately a lot of the sort of costs of building the suburbs kind of got hidden somewhere, and it's like the true cost of that infrastructure is not necessarily being borne by individual suburban counties. And in a lot of cases, the urban core is the area which has the most of that infrastructure, right? Like they're the ones who are going to have to keep the streets clean around the subway stations and things like that. There's a number of reasons why cities are just more expensive to run. So I think, yes, I agree. Like we do have to more broadly find ways of making dense, walkable, healthy places less expensive, whether that's urban or suburban. I don't think it, matters so much, but I think that the broader problem that this question is sort of bringing up is, why are the places that are that have good schools, that are pleasant to live in, that are safe, why are these places expensive? And the answer I would contend is that we don't build enough housing in those places. And if we built more housing, there would probably be less expensive housing in those places. And we've got to find a way to do that and also still preserve all the good things that people, the reasons why those are nice places to live in.
And I'm certainly not the first person to argue that low density suburbs require even more infrastructure of the physical infrastructure, and their property taxes don't pay for it.
Yeah,
They don't cover it. Chuck Maroon calls it a Ponzi scheme. And
Not to mention that often the city, the municipal government of a city needs to directly actually, expend resources in the service of maintaining the kind of, suburban lifestyle. So like in New York, where I'm coming from, there's an insane amount of like nonstop roadway construction that basically accommodates people driving in from Long Island and, and other suburban locales around the city. So the city, in addition to, all of its other issues, ends up like, as Diana said, like bearing the cost of the lifestyle of the people that live in the suburbs.
so if we started to equalize property taxes on a per acre basis, God, I can't believe someone's calling me right in the middle. Just a scam call. Damn. But all right, so let me shift over. So we have a question that was in the Zoom. Can you address the way, and this, Diana, this sort of gets at some of, I think, your interest in the marketing of suddenly calling them tiny homes instead of mobile homes, or other, in the book, you go through quite a lot of, calling co-living, co-living becomes kind of glamorous as opposed to, SR, single residence occupancy or boarding houses and things. So can you address the way in which industry has affected our ideals and ambitions for our housing through marketing, commercialism, the proliferation of industries that profit from the expansion of house ambitions, the housing industry complex, if you will?
Yeah. Well, so I definitely think that is true, that there is a housing industrial complex that is, kind of propping up various different ideals for people. And it's just, it's the same as just say, like, you watch an ad for a car and all of a sudden you're kind of transported and thinking that this car is going to change your life or whatnot. Very similarly, I think that there is ways in which we have ideas of, how housing is going to transform our lives as well. I think, there's just, for so many years, there have been ways in which we've promoted that kind of single family home ideal. What I'm more aware of is also ways in which we, through language, start to disparage any, the alternatives to that. So like, instead of calling co-living like an amazing community for that people could experience, it gets called adult dorms in the news. Or instead of it being like a multi-generational living situation is a great way for family members to support each other, it's called doubling up. Children who live at home are, failing to launch. These kinds of, ways in which we just continually, provide this image of what a family should be and what a house should be. I think it really kind of intimidates people from thinking about, that from just kind of even questioning like how some of these things could be good things. And I think also one of the other things is the US media market is so insular. We have very little idea of how other people live in other places. So, there was, I think, a New York Times article recently about people living in Tokyo in like 95 square feet. And the amount of kind of social media reaction, just talking about like how ridiculous this was. And I saw someone respond and say, like, you all just outed yourself as having absolutely no idea how most of the rest of the world lives, and lives perfectly happily in that way. And so I think that like a lot of people are unaware that the dominant way of living outside the US is multi-generationally. And that, living that in many other countries, living in a dense downtown with a walkable neighborhood is the way that you live and is completely normal and, and valued. So I think that in a way we have closed off those kinds of conversations. And I think we also need to find ways of showcasing other ways of living beyond what ends up happening so often is like kind of like an idealized Northern European version of it, when there's just so much else going on in other places in the world. So yeah.
Yeah. I know one study, I think a professor at Cornell was interested in measuring there's a lot of people now that measure happiness. And so sort of, if you eat a chocolate bar, it makes you happy for about 30 minutes. Buying a McMansion out on the edge, he actually was able to kind of study and calculate and said about 6 months of happiness comes from that. And after that, the commute drives you crazy. And you're not as happy about, oh, I'm so happy that I have a game room, a mail cave, and a sewing room, and a this and a that, and
gift wrapping room.
All that.
The gift wrapping room, I think.
Yes, the gift wrapping room. That should be, yes, exactly. Yeah. I mean, I don't know.
Well, I think it's also, Diana, you talk in your book about how morality became part of the sort of lexicon with which housing was talked about, that in the 1900s, housing was just where you lived. But as we kind of got into the early 20th century, the discussion around housing took on moral dimensions. And so, yeah, I think it's not surprising that when you spend a century kind of, claiming that the single family house is not only, more hygienic or has access to better light and air or like objectively measurable things, but is a morally superior way to live. Yeah, it's really tough to kind of like shake out of that.
And that one gets also, that's similar to one of the questions here. How can we assess the validity of the concern for losing privately owned space in existing neighborhoods? In other words, what does that transition process look like? People, even though it may be my neighbor's yard that is getting the ADU, I don't own it, but if it's part of my view, it's part of my bird habitat, people do have concern. Do we validate those concerns? Do we address them? Is anyone doing a good job?
Sorry, go ahead. No.
I was just going to say, like, I think that question kind of comes down to like, why don't we have better planning? That like, if we more adequately planned to kind of, provide at a municipal level the things that people need, like good outdoor space and stuff like that, then we wouldn't need to worry about, whether or not that is being provided by private space, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I also think that, I have many conversations with people who seem to me very educated about a variety of different topics in their city and have had very little conversation about the dynamics of the housing, of building more housing. And, these kinds of conversations that we're having today, and sort of like, that's not part of the regular discourse. So, I had a friend tell me about an enormous development going up in her neighborhood that is right next to the train station, and how concerned she was about this and the parking issues that it was going to create, and the fact that it was going to be huge, and the light and the air. And it was just like, wow, you are bringing up all these, concerns. And it's like, I just need to have, half an hour talking to you about like the pros and the cons of the situation. And I think ultimately it kind of reminds me of the situation with COVID, which is like, are you wearing a mask for yourself? Or are you wearing a mask to be part of all of us wearing a masks all of us wearing masks so that we're able to kind of have, bring COVID cases down, right? Like, in the very beginning and whatnot. And so I think that, like, are we building housing? We have to think about why we're building the housing in the first place, because it's not just your concerns about your own backyard. It's about the fact that we're going to have another, tens of millions of people living in this country, and if we don't build housing for them, what's going to happen? It's going to be a lot worse than having, an accessory dwelling unit in your backyard. It's going to be a lot worse than that. So I think that people really need to kind of get educated about some of the, like, give and take that is necessary here. It's not just about you and your own situation.
On that note of more education, I think we're going to call that a day. I very much want to thank Diana Lind and Andrew Bruno. You've been listening to episode 27 of Redesigning Cities, the Speedwell Foundation Talks at Georgia Tech. A video and podcast of this event will be posted to our website, arch.gatech.edu/redesigning-cities. And that's also where you can check out previous episodes. And I'd like to invite the in-person audience to a reception outside. It's a little chilly, but I think hopefully it's warmed up just enough. And Diana, I'm so sorry I can't include you in the reception. Hopefully we'll have a chance sometime to share some a drink, some goodies, something. Thank you very much.
That'd be great. Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you.